I'm looking again. I'm going to go back to what's rallying. We're showing it on the screen. It's technology stocks that are pushing higher right now. And one of the reasons is, helium comes from the Gulf, critical in stabilization, cooling, in the etching and deposition process and chip manufacturing. Energy prices have been impacted by this war in Iran. Why is it, to your mind, that the tech industry is seeing some relief from the idea of a ceasefire?
Well, because we're not going to all-out war is the short answer. And so I think everyone is taking this bit of good news that there's a 2-week ceasefire and running with it. But the reality is that the Pandora's box in the Persian Gulf has been opened. And by that, I mean, even if we have an extended ceasefire and cessation of hostilities that lasts longer term here, we have now seen Iran demonstrate capability and political will to strike critical infrastructure across this region, to include very high-value targets like data centers, multi-billion data centers, including explicit threats against OpenAI's Stargate project in UAE, right. Not to mention the number of AWS sites that have been struck already in Bahrain and UAE. So that's just a completely different investor climate overall for this region. But coming to supply chains, though, as you said, when we talk about helium supply, bromine, just energy supply overall, Iran also has an interest in allowing transit through the strait. But that's where we come back to political conditions that will be attached to the ceasefire.
Caroline and I discussed in detail the vulnerability of data center assets in the Gulf. As it relates to China, for example, there is a long-term threat to Taiwan and the concentration of semiconductor manufacturing. With that taken all into account, how conscious are companies like Apple on now changing where they plan to build future products and have a footprint in the future for their manufacturing operations?
Well, there are multiple drivers in play here, not just geopolitical risk, obviously, but also the evolution of U.S. trade strategy, which is still in play. As we know, there's a pending Section 232 still on semiconductors that could contain component tariffs, right, that implicate the devices that contain those semiconductors, not to mention looking beyond tariffs, content requirements, right? So far, for example, we have regional value content requirements for automotive parts. Imagine that applied to electronics more broadly. So I think, companies like Apple are looking at these issues in parallel to say, yes, there is a lot concentrated still in Taiwan. Device manufacturers also in China, that geopolitical risk is only amplified, but at the same time, there are going to be a lot of disruptors coming from the U.S. to try to drive more, not just onshoring, but more regionalized trade and bring more of that manufacturing base to the Western Hemisphere as well.
I want to just go a little bit further with where Ed took us in terms of China, because there's a lot of really well-read stories on the Bloomberg today thinking about how maybe the U.S. has reduced its overall, power among allies and adversaries at the moment because of what's happened in Iran, in particular when it comes to China. And the Iran campaign has been, quote, a serious setback for Trump, is what one particular Chinese foreign ministry advisor had told us. What does that mean for U.S.-China relations? What does that mean about AI access, chip access, the relationship that we have?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you contrast where we are today in the wake of this Iran miscalculation on part of the U.S. and then compare it to where we were late last year when the Busan truce was struck, back then, the U.S. was caught flat-footed by Chinese export controls on critical raw materials. And so the U.S. was in a very reactive mode when it went to Busan. Those truce terms were set. And I think the whole intent going into the next summit in Beijing was to come with a more assertive position with China to say, look, we're doing things to reindustrialize the U.S., protect critical infrastructure. We're not explicitly calling out China in these measures. So you know what? You don't get a vote on these areas. And the U.S. is going to be forging ahead. Now, because of the Iran dynamic, that certainly tamps down the confidence, right? That the ability of the U.S. to assert itself in the same way. And Beijing sees that. Beijing certainly is in a more confident position going into the summit. It has very explicit demands, for example, not just to reduce, maintain tariff levels at the Busan truce level, but to reduce them, not just to restrain U.S. technology controls, but to actually roll them back. And this is where the U.S. has been doing more country agnostic measures as well, trying to say, look, China, we're not out to get you. But Beijing's message is, I see what you're doing here, and it's got to stop. And so their interest is to make everything a red line, which means that we have a number of friction points heading into the summit. Not to mention where the status of the Iran issue is also going to consume a lot of oxygen going into that meeting.